Well, hello and welcome to the fourth session in our leadership chat, fireside chat series. And my name is Nicole Parker, the Director of U.S. Outreach for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And in this fireside chat series, we speak with leaders at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance about relevant and timely science policy topics and how publishing in JSPG can elevate skill sets of the next generation in policy. So we also want to take the time to thank STEMPeers for sponsoring this series. Also, just want to let you all know that if you missed our last session with Mehrdad Hariri about the intersection of diversity and science policy, you can view it on our series page. Today in our conversation, we'll have a focus on STEM education and workforce policies. And I have the pleasure of speaking with JSPG's Senior Advisor, Shalin Jyotishi. Shalin also serves as a Senior Policy Analyst for the Center of Education and Labor at New America, and his expertise centers on public problem solving where higher education, the workforce, technology innovation, and science and innovation policy converge. So with that, I'd like to welcome Shalin to our conversation today. So just to get us started, what is your day job and how did you get in your current role in science policy? And it'd be really great if you could share with our listeners a few pivotal experiences that solidified your career path towards your current role.
Sure, happy to do that, Nicole, and thanks for having me. As you all know from my time as CEO of JSPG, complicating things is one of my core competencies. So my day job is a little bit complicated. I actually have three hats. I'm a senior analyst on education and labor, where I focus on public problem solving, where higher ed, the workforce, emerging technologies, and innovation policy converge. I'm a visiting scholar at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where I'm working on a book on science policy with Toby Smith from the governing board of JSPG, Kei Koizumi from OSTP, and Jennifer McCormick from Penn State. And I house that work at AAAS. And my latest role is to join the World Economic Forum as a fellow in artificial intelligence, where I'm focused on how we can improve the quality of jobs using technology and AI-based solutions. So with each of these three sort of roles, there's intersections of science policy. I'm actually one of the oddballs in this field in that I got involved in this space in my teens. I actually started out in undergrad. I was a research assistant on the now defunct Science of Science and Innovation Policy Program, SciSIP, complicated name to fit the brand. Which was really looking at board members of universities, AAU institutions in particular, and their relationships with corporate board members and how these relationships affect conflict of interest policies, technology transfer, lab to market functions between in university industries and university industry partnerships. So it was really that experience that sort of brought me into this space. Lots of pivotal experiences between then and now, including some great mentors, Jim Turner, who was then general counsel of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. It was thanks to Jim that I read the Bayh-Dole Act before I turned 21. So I have Jim to thank for that. Toby Smith, of course, from AAU has been a long-time mentor, and it was really the opportunity to work on the federally funded project as an undergraduate student. I'm a direct product of federally funded research in terms of my career path in science policy. In terms of sort of topical focus, I've always been at the intersection of higher ed, the workforce, and tech innovation. That's sort of been my sweet spot from the get-go. I worked on university-based economic development at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. I worked in science and tech policy at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and through various consulting roles. And at New America, I'm hoping to blend my various paths and my various portfolios into sort of a new sort of research agenda that's at the intersection of these points. So that's a little bit on me and how I got here.
Now, you've mentioned a lot of different hats there, and so I have to ask, what's your favorite hat or your favorite part, right, of your job, since you have you have your hands in so many different things that sound very exciting.
Oh gosh, Nicole, I'm gonna get in trouble here. Well, that's a little bit like picking your favorite child. I think there are through lines between really all of the positions I've had that I really value. I think first and foremost is the opportunity to ask tough questions and challenge conventional wisdom. A part of what I like at working at a think tank is you have a level of independence to be a truth speaker. When you work for trade associations or special interest groups, you're beholden to your employers. And what I really appreciate about sort of the policy space that I'm in now is, at New America, we're really encouraged to push the envelope, to say difficult things, to really shed light on things that need clarity. And I really appreciate that authenticity, that space for creative, thinking, entrepreneurialism, risk taking. Sometimes we say things and there's consequences, and there's a risk tolerance that I really appreciate. And all of those are attributes that I really value in sort of this environment. It's interesting, in science policy, we always sort of pride evidence-based or evidence-informed decision making. The reality of policy and politics is much more complicated than sort of what the data says. And what I appreciate about New America is you have the opportunity to speak your truth, but balance it with these other strategies that policy influencers use to build a better world.
Nice. Well, I think you navigated that very well without, picking your favorite child. So thanks for that response. And so kind of want to work into our next topic, which is, as you know, JSPG recently launched a call for papers on STEM education and workforce development. You were a part of our webinar series on that recently and really helped moderate one of our webinars in that area. And to our listeners, all those webinars can be found on our YouTube page. And so with your expertise and work in this space, we have a few questions. The first one, which I will ask, is what do you see as hot topics in your field? And what does this mean for the future of science policy?
I think that's a great question. It's a huge question. I think in education and workforce, it's a massive ocean to boil. You have the K through 12 work, you have the middle skill world, which is where I live in most often. You have sort of the graduate reform, you have postdoc reform, you have different aspects of education and workforce innovation. I'll speak with the lens that I used during the webinar we all organized, with community colleges and the middle skill workforce at the heart. And when I say middle skill, I mean jobs that require more than a high school diploma, but less than a bachelor's degree. Sometimes we forget only 2/3 of Americans have bachelor's degrees. So if we're serious about improving the well-being of people in this country, it's really this level of the market, the labor market, that we ought to prioritize for workforce strategy. In my humble and risk-taking opinion. So there are a couple of things that stand out to me in terms of really hot button topics. There are so many of them, but these are just ones that come to the surface for me in the moment. The first is around new models for career preparation, even at the middle skill level. I love this sort of movement towards non-degree pathways for education and training, modular, oftentimes stackable, but not exclusively, programs ranging from your week-long boot camps to your short-term certificate programs, your year-long certificate programs, your multi-year apprenticeship programs. There are different ways to gain the skills one needs to excel in a job and in a career place. And historically, we've used on a proxy for skill, the degree, as sort of the main level of signaling whether somebody's ready for a particular job. And I think that's really changing for the better. So, I would really love to see more work done around what is a quality non-degree program, how can community colleges and frankly universities make more evidence-informed decisions around what programs to offer, how they're offered, and why. And a little bit more of a sort of a strategic view on how we go about funding these programs, making them affordable, making them equitable, addressing occupational segregation. Many occupations, especially at the middle skill level, are heavily segregated by race and gender. Manufacturing jobs tend to pay the best at this segment of the labor market. They're dominated by white men. Healthcare jobs, you see heavy representation for women of color, but wages, job quality, advancement ladders are quite low. Really thinking strategically about some of these things. So that's one, non-degree program innovation. The second is, how can we advance competency-based education and competency-based hiring by coming up with a better infrastructure to account for the full breadth of skills one has? Age, gender, race, ethnicity, years of experience, credentials, and the pedigree of where you got your credentials, all of these, every single one, is a proxy for skills. None of them are actual evaluations of the skills one has. None of them accurately represent the full breadth of skills one has. In this moment, we use resumes and cover letters and networks to apply for jobs and to demonstrate that we have the skills that an employer is requesting, but they're all still proxies, and they're of course rife with biases and inaccuracies, opportunities for fraud. There's this movement called learning and employment records, LERs, which is a sort of technological infrastructure. It's a blockchain-based infrastructure. The US Chamber of Commerce Foundation is convening this sort of community of practice around LERs that I think is very exciting. It allows a learner to own their learner record and their skills profile and to represent the full breadth of verified skills that they've gained through life, whether it's military service, education, entrepreneurialism, volunteering, all of these things that folks do, but aren't always able to communicate persuasively to HR folks, I think ought to be better represented. So for those in the audience who are interested in digging more, my shameless plug, my colleague Isabel Cardenas-Navia and I published this cover piece in Issues in Science and Technology called Everything You've Ever Learned. And it sort of is a primer on what LERs are, what are the opportunities, what are the limitations, and how could we push this forward. So I think it's very exciting, the LER space. And the final space that I'd flag as really salient in the education and labor world is job quality. I mean, look, we look at all these surveys, 40 to 50% of US workers report being unhappy at work. We know that a significant section of our labor market works full time and is not able to make a living wage. The labor market is broken. And I think now more than ever, the pandemic laid this bare with essential workers, but we had markers even before then. We need to pay better mind to the quality of the jobs that we have and to ensure that we have work worth doing. There's lots of dimensions to this. Some of my colleagues advocate that the best way to help low-wage workers is to automate low-wage work and to get workers into higher paying, higher quality jobs. When I say job quality here, I want to be very clear. There are specific criteria we use to define what a quality of a job is. Scheduling predictability, pay at the local living wage, benefits packages, paid leave. There are certain markers that the Aspen Institute and others have developed over the years that are extremely important. So I think the Great Resignation has sort of brought this to the forefront. People aren't accepting working low quality jobs for unacceptable wages. And I think that's a wonderful development. I think it's a great push to dispel the skills gap myth. If you see somebody saying skills gap when they're talking about workforce development, I think you ought to be skeptical about the credibility of the person. This is my controversial opinion now coming to the forefront. At some level, there are skills gaps, but really we have to be thinking about the quality of the jobs that are offered to the workers, whether they're acceptable for the country that we're trying to build, and think about what we need to do to make sure that we fulfill legitimate labor market needs, but do it in a way that's appropriate and fair to workers as well. So, so job quality as a priority for workforce development is something that I think is exciting. Normally, we focus on education and training. This is something on the labor side of the house that I think is getting a lot of attention, and I'm excited by that.
Yeah, those are all extremely exciting topics, and particularly for your first one that you mentioned, I really think people should check out our webinar that you moderated to get a lot more information on that. And I can agree that I think we've all witnessed these labor shortages as we've gone out, and we've seen that there's not a lot of people working in, you know, our typical places that we venture out to for services. So great points there. And so now I'm going to take a pause and introduce our CEO and managing publisher, Adriana Bankston, and she's going to ask a couple of questions.
Thank you, Nicole. Great to be here, Shalin. This is fascinating. I could talk about workforce development all day, so no, we share that interest, and Nicole does as well. So I love your first answer. And of course, you have several years of experience in this field, and I always enjoy learning from you. And I think you have a really interesting perspective in a different sector than other folks work in. But I also know that having worked with you at the journal, you know, you are somebody who is a visionary and always looking to the future. So I'm curious to hear more about where you think workforce development is going in the future. So, you know, if we look 10 years ahead, how do you see this field evolving, and how can we create more equitable policies for to support the workforce of the future, even post-pandemic?
I think that's a really, really fantastic question. Gosh, I think if we were to look across history, every new generations, along with new technologies, I think are the single most significant driver of social paradigm shifts. Each generation is shaped by social, cultural, psychological, economic norms that are different from the one prior. And I'm actually optimistic that millennials and Gen Zs and Gen Alphas are going to demand much more from the world of education and work than prior generations have. Rather than being molded and shaped by education and work, I think we might see that education and work will be molded and shaped by the contemporary needs of the next and new generation. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't to say that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not everything in the world of education and work is broken. Clearly, it does work. To some extent, but it doesn't work as well for everyone equitably. And I think that's the difference. I think in the most recent years, you know, the awakening around racial reconciliation, an acknowledgement of the segmented labor markets and the diverging labor markets with essential workers and the pandemic have really laid bare the fact that too many individuals in the US, but frankly around the world, are not doing well in terms of education and workforce advancement. You know, I would say bold, ambitious entrepreneurialism and advocacy is just a great way to push for change. And I'd actually point to my three sort of highlighted areas are of areas where I think it's actually the youth and the next generation that are driving some of those innovations. Let's talk about non-degree programs. If we look at Strata Education Network's Public Viewpoint Survey, we have seen that demand for non-degree programs exceeds interest in degree programs. People want non-degree pathways to jobs. We also see from the Credential Engine report recently that the supply of these these non-degree programs is on the up. So I do think colleges and universities and even for-profits and other training providers are responding to the demands of consumers. I also think it's important that we start calling students for what they are. They are consumers of higher education. They do purchase higher education in many, many instances. It's we just point to the student debt crisis if you need some level of evidence for that. We look at things like the learning and employment record movement. We see examples where there is a level of disconnect between what a hiring manager is able to evaluate a candidate on and what the candidate says that they have. There have been a number of surveys done on this. There's a level of opaqueness on the side of the employer as well as on the side of the applicant in terms of skill attainment and skill level. So I think this moving away from proxies for skills to systems like LERs is really exciting, and in part driven by the fact that now more than ever, there are new ways to gain skills. You don't need a liberal arts degree to gain critical thinking skills. I know people really don't like to hear that, but the internet now exists. There are new ways to do things. So, you know, this sort of skill profile piece, I think, is important. And then job quality, as we just mentioned. I mean, we now have very clear evidence. Somebody can work a skilled job, not a minimum wage, you know, job at a fast food restaurant. They can work a skilled job full time and not make enough to pay their bills, to work at the local living wage. And I think all of these things are have become levels of priority for young people in particular. And we also see this bear out in terms of the Great Resignation and, frankly, the lack of labor force participation among young people. At some level, it's you know, the enrollment declines at community colleges is you know, due to the pandemic. But at another level, I do think it's this sort of reckoning around job quality and the interest to find work that's fair and equitable in terms of compensation and in terms of levels of self-actualization. Your Maslow's hierarchy of needs 101 here. So, you know, that's what I would see in terms of the future. I really see the next generation as having a really important role to play. Thinking a little bit bigger picture here and beyond the US, in many, many countries, the population under 30 greatly exceeds the population over 30, especially in developing countries. This isn't just something localized to the US. I do think we're in the midst of a generational shift, the way baby boomers shift their generation when they were young as well. So I think it's actually a very exciting time in terms of population demographics. And I think that's something that that researchers and activists and advocates should all pay a bit of mind to when they're developing their strategies for education and workforce development.
Great. Yeah, that's a great answer. And we did get a question from our audience about sort of the future of the workforce, which you sort of answered. But to sort of flip this around, thinking also in the context of our special issue, you know, how can young people push the boundaries of policymaking in this field, and sort of what should they think about when they're submitting to the issue, and again, their contribution to changing the future of workforce development?
That is a great question. I'm always mindful of offering specifics when it comes to these types of questions. I will say, in the world of education and workforce development, there are lots of assumptions and myths that are propagated and promoted and frankly well guarded. I'm thinking back to our webinar that we had organized around at the community college level and community college workforce innovation. And we got a question from the audience that was, how can we expand undergraduate research opportunities to community college students? And we had asked one of our panelists who represented the private sector, employers in the tech sector, whether she felt that it was valuable for community college students to get undergraduate research experience. And the answer was no. And you can even see in the framing of this question, how can we expand undergraduate research experience for community college students? We don't really think about whether that aligns with what the labor market needs and whether that will help the student get the best possible quality job that they can. So it's an interesting sort of environment because students and early career researchers, I think, are both, the advocates of change and the enablers of change, but also the beneficiaries of the status quo system and the frameworks of the status quo system. So I guess if there was one thing I would encourage the audience to do is to sort of really challenge conventional wisdom. I think when it comes to education to work, that continuum in particular, really focusing on the employer needs is helpful. I worry a little bit of an overcorrection and focusing too much on what employers want, and abandoning the value of a broad-based education and a global mindset and critical thinking and some of these other things that may not necessarily be number one on the priority list for a particular employer. But the undergraduate research question sort of, it's a direct manifestation of the disconnect that happens between academia and employers. Another thing that came to mind from our webinar as well is just sort of general awareness of what workers at the middle skill level do. We had Marianne Pizzelli from Department of Commerce at NIST, MEP, on the panel, and nobody in the, well, one person in the audience actually had manufacturing career paths advocated to them as a student. People don't know that manufacturing is such an important occupation for so many people. And, I think when we're talking about the science policy community, that's largely rooted at R1, some R2s, largely the elite crest of society, in sort of tactical terms. It can sometimes be difficult to see sort of this segment of the labor market, which is why I think it's so exciting that JSPG is elevating community colleges in this way. Usually when people talk about workforce development and community colleges, they're like, oh, transfer. No. There's so much more to be done there. So that, I think that would be, if I were to say, give one piece of advice, that is probably the one that I would give most, given our webinar and the discussions we've had so far with prospective authors, is really sort of conventional, rethink conventional wisdom. There are a couple of organizations that I think are also helpful for the authors for this issue. I'd be remiss if I didn't plug the Center on Education and Labor at New America. The Lumina Foundation is very thoughtful about education and workforce reform. The Aspen Institute, I think, is very thoughtful on job quality. Maureen Conway and her team at the Aspen Institute. There are certain organizations out there that I think authors could turn to sort of, the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University, Tony Carnevale's shop. There's certain resources out there that I think can help guide, but it's difficult. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this space. There's a lot of special interests in this space. There's a lot of money in this space. And all of those things make it a very cloudy environment to figure out what's real and what's smoke and mirrors. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So I'm glad you made a connection between the educational workforce and that transition, and also different sectors that people don't always think about. I'm really curious to see what submissions we get for the issue as well. And I'm glad that we, like we discussed before, we wanted to cover different pathways into a workforce that weren't necessarily traditional. So I'm really glad that we had this angle in there and in the webinar as well. So thank you. So I'll turn it back to Nicole now for our next section.
Thanks, Adriana. So we're going to take a little shift in the last few minutes that we have, and we we really want to talk about your role as senior advisor to JSPG. So in that role, what do you see as the value of the journal for the next generation of leaders in science policy? And maybe talk about why students should even get involved with JSPG.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I have to start off by congratulating all of you on the recent issue that came out celebrating our latest 10-year celebration activity. You know, I think it's just incredible reflecting over the 10 years or so that JSPG has been around and in this business. You know, why should students get involved with JSPG? It's a great question. When JSPG was first established, there really was the ecosystem supporting early career researchers in science policy was very nascent. The ESEP coalition didn't exist in the form it does now. NSPN didn't exist. You know, there weren't as many players around. Many of the fellowship programs didn't exist. There weren't very many resources available to help students in early career researchers engage in science policy. And I think JSPG filled a really important need there. One reason why I think JSPG in particular is really worth the time for students and early career researchers is because it's a credible, visible, relevant place to publish in-depth, substantive, concrete ideas and to gain access to a platform to be heard. There is a great deal of value in publishing op-eds in the mainstream media outlets or even the trade outlets, but the level of depth that some of our pieces get into at JSPG can't really be communicated in an 800-word op-ed in so-and-so outlet. And I think that's a bit unique. You know, I think you all have done a great job just you know, making sure that we're not in the business of putting more PDFs on the internet and calling it a day, really doing the follow-up webinars, partnering with the influencers and the shapers of science policy to elevate these early career voices. This organization was founded by and for early career professionals, but in less than 10 years, we've managed to elevate author perspectives at COP26 happening right now. The UN, federal and state policymakers, the media, we're working alongside organizations that have been in the business of science policy for decades, centuries in some cases, right? So I think that's really a testimony to the visibility and the credibility that JSPG has established for the value that early career researchers bring to some of these topics. I think if that level of credibility was not present, you would not have the level of partnerships and engagement that the journal does. I think JSPG is deeply embedded across the jugular of science policy. Our governing board members, our advisory board members, our partners are all those in decision-making roles for how science policy issues are shaped and communicated. And I think that positions published authors really well to be competitive, to build a career in this space, or even if they're pursuing their main STEM-oriented career outside of policy, it gives them the credibility, it gives them the cachet to advocate for the ideas they have on different policy issues. So there are many ways to engage in science policy. I encourage the audience to explore all of them. NSPN, the ESEP Coalition, all of JSPG's partners have wonderful resources. But I do think the journal brings something pretty unique in that respect that I think has great staying power.
No, that's great. And you talked a lot about, you know, how much JSPG has grown. So one more question before I turn it back to Adriana is, what is the future of JSPG in your opinion?
Oh gosh, I should be reflecting that question back to Adriana and you all. You are the future of JSPG. You know, I think what I think is most exciting about the journal is this. It's kind of, you know, piggybacking on my last response. It's taking concrete, in-depth ideas that early career researchers had developed and doing something with them. We did a webinar a couple of years back called Fantastic Briefs and What to Do with Them, you know, and I think that's exactly right. In academia, writing is the bread and butter of everything, right? But it's not good enough just to find a solution. I think sometimes this goes a little bit ununderstood in the space. There really needs to be some follow-up to get traction around ideas. So I think the more JSPG can do to equip authors with the skills, the networks, the platforms to share their ideas and get them enacted, positioning the authors to be their best advocates is a really exciting value proposition that frankly a lot of other outlets just don't do. It's just not part of their MO, and it is part of JSPG's MO, and I think that's a bit unique.
Great, and so now Adriana has a few more questions before we close it out.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I have to say, I'm not gonna tell you what the future of the journal is right now. You should watch the first chat because we talked about that in there. But, I will say, to credit Shalin for where we are right now, for the visibility and credibility that we have is all that he has done all over the years. And so I wanna, shift a little bit now to talk about leadership. Obviously, this is a leadership chat. You've led the journal very successfully and also have a number of other leadership roles, as Nicole mentioned. So, to talk a little bit about, we're in the business of building leaders of tomorrow in the field, and what does that mean? How can they go after these sorts of leadership opportunities, and what does leadership mean for you?
Thank you very much for the kind words, Adriana. It's really kind of you. Working with you all on the JSPG team has been one of my greatest professional privileges. It's something that I really, really value. I think what leadership means to me, truthfully, I think leadership is, there's a quote on my wall. I think all of you have heard me ramble about this quote several times, but it's by Teddy Roosevelt, and it says, "Far and away, the best prize that life has to offer is a chance to work hard at work worth doing." And I actually think that's what leadership is. It's an opportunity to work hard at work worth doing. If you're in a leadership role, then by extension, you have some level of responsibility over the success of your team, over some level of coalition, whether it's a company you're leading, whether it's a project you're leading, whether it's a team you're leading, whether it's a lab you're leading. You have some level of responsibility that's on your shoulders, and it sort of puts you in a position to make a difference. I think for me, when it comes to, if I look back and I think, what have I learned most from my JSPG experiences or any other positions where you have that level of responsibility, I think it would boil down to finding value and pleasure in the effort and not actually getting too focused on destination. There's a professor at Stanford University, Andrew Huberman, who has a podcast that I listen to, Huberman Lab podcast, and he sort of talks about this, and he says there's pleasure in effort, and there's this whole level of science that he can explain and I cannot. But I actually think there's a lot of sort of practical truth to that, to people who are in leadership roles. In leadership roles, you fail. You make mistakes. You do your best and it's not good enough. You do your best and it is good enough, but it's portrayed as not good enough. You run into difficult challenges. You have difficult conversations. All of these things, I think, are part of the job. I don't necessarily think leadership is something that everyone inherently needs or wants or desires. I think it's something that's usually sought out. And I think what's important for leaders to know is, fail fast and learn and really grow, and having that level of self-awareness of reflecting on, your successes and your failures, and growing from them is a great skill to cultivate. And I think I've certainly gained those skills from any level of leadership positions that I've had, because it's a fact of life. I also think leaders can sometimes become perfectionists and maybe are a little bit too hard on themselves, or a little bit too focused on the destination. I think it was Eisenhower who said this, or I think that's right. But accomplishment will prove to be a journey, not a destination, I think is how the quote goes. And I think that really rings true and aligns with the Teddy Roosevelt quote on my wall. So that's what I would say about sort of leadership, and for those who are seeking out leadership, I think that's a great skill to cultivate, is, finding pleasure and value and satisfaction in the effort of work, and then in the process of achieving and leading and making a difference.
Yeah, great answer. That definitely, I think I've experienced a lot of those things since I've taken on this role, and definitely can say that I'm learning as I go and trying to improve every day. But that's really great advice. So the last question, sort of bringing this back to your career, and how JSPG has played a role in your journey, and sort of where do you see yourself going next, again through this whole question of how can JSPG help the next generation of leaders, and how did that sort of happen for you in your journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'd lean on my last response. I think what I gained most out of my JSPG experience is a fast forwarding of learning in my career trajectory. What it would have taken me 10 years to learn in my career, I learned in half that time, because I had this role with JSPG. It supercharged my learning. It supercharged my growth. It supercharged my sort of how I go about evaluating successes and failures. All of the lessons learned. It amplified the level of learning that I was able to undertake in a short amount of time. And I think that's really the value of all leadership positions, whether you're an early career researcher who's getting involved with your local science policy club, or you're taking on grassroots advocacy role. I think, I just think back on, what I mentioned in the prior response, but leadership at the end of the day is a responsibility of some sort. I mean, you have to lead something. And I think that level of learning that you get from taking on additional responsibilities, pushing yourself, pushing the envelopes of your current sort of your mindset, your capabilities, your skills, knowledge, abilities, your networks, all of these things. That's sort of the value of leadership. It's kind of like weightlifting for your mind and your psyche, right? I mean, you have to just push yourself a little bit, go a little bit almost to failure, and then you grow. And that's really how I reflect on my JSPG experience. I think it was weightlifting for my career in many ways, and it's been very valuable, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. And we've talked about this before, so continuous learning and reassessing where you are and how you can take the next step. And definitely that's something you're learning in this role. Great, thank you. So finally, just let Nicole wrap up here.
Yeah, so before we do officially close, do you have any additional thoughts or closing comments that you would like to provide before we sign off today?
I think I'd just like to thank you all for all the great work that you're doing. Thank the editors, thank the authors, thank all of our partners and supporters for helping to advance this mission of elevating and validating the value of having early career voices in shaping science and technology policy and governance. I think I always get very excited when a new issue comes out, because you're able to see the level of excitement among authors and the level of follow-up and the commitment to follow-up that often happens. And it's just, I really do think that the alignment of new voices, the next generation, with substantive, well thought out ideation around policy innovation is a very powerful matchmaking, especially in this time and in this environment we're in, as I alluded to earlier. So I think JSPG is doing great work, and congratulations for all you've accomplished and will accomplish.
Well, thank you, Shalin, for all your great points today and for all the encouragement as we continue to move forward and make JSPG a great organization. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about JSPG and about STEM education and workforce policy, and also how they can get involved in this endeavor. And so we want to thank everyone who took the time to listen in to this fireside chat, and to let you all know that we will have another one that's scheduled on December 8th with our JSPG governing board member, Lyda Benison. And so we hope that you all will join us for our next one in December. And thank you again, and we will see you all next month.
Thank you all so much.